Good afternoon, everybody. We are just going to give folks a few more minutes to join. We're at 34 at the moment. We'll just wait for a couple more people. Then we'll get started. Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Umunyana. I'm the Executive Director of Section 27, and we are happy to welcome you to PILG and to this session this afternoon. We have an excellent panel with us today. We're really excited to be able to have this conversation, which is a matter of great public debate at the moment in South Africa and everywhere else in the world. So we are here to talk about vaccine mandates, the constitutional implications of vaccine mandates, and how we can reconcile individual rights and public health. I would like to start by thanking the excellent team from Section 27 who helped put together this session, Baone, Mbali, Julia, and Subusiwe. Thank you guys. They're also going to be behind the scenes helping us keep this session on track. As I said, we have an excellent panel. I will start by introducing them. We are still waiting for one of our panelists, but we'll go ahead and introduce this panel to you, and then we will start the discussion. So we have Tessa Dooms, who is a sociologist and political analyst with extensive experience in the youth mobilization and development sector. She is a social development practitioner inspired by the values of participation, social justice, human-centered design. She has worked across Africa, engaging youth, governments, corporations, and non-governmental actors. Tessa has a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Psychology and Honors and Masters of Sociology from the University of Wits. We also have with us Safura Abdul Karim. She is a researcher at the MRC's Center for Health Economics and Decision Science and at Priceless, the Priority Cost Effective Lessons for System Strengthening, which is a research unit based at Wits School of Public Health. Her work focuses on prevention and control of non-communicable diseases through the use of legal and policy mechanisms, as well as using the law to improve health outcomes more broadly. Safura is a 2020 Aspen New Voices Fellow, has an LLB from the University of Cape Town, an LLM in Global Health from Georgetown University, and she's currently pursuing her PhD at the University of KZN on constitutional rights and non-communicable diseases. We also have with us Professor Pierre de Vos. He is the Claude Leon Foundation Chair in Constitutional Governance and teaches constitutional law at the University of Cape Town. He's also the head of Department of Public Health there. He has a BCom Law, an LLB, an LLM from the University of Stellenbosch, as well as an LLM from Columbia University in New York, and an LLD from the University of the Western Cape. Professor de Vos is the co-editor of the South African Constitutional Law in Context and serves on the Advisory Council of the Council for Advancement of the South African Constitution, CASAC. He's also a member of the board of PEN South Africa. He writes a well-known blog on social and political issues from a constitutional perspective called Constitutionally Speaking, which I'm sure we've all seen at some point. We also have, lastly, Professor Halton Cheadle. He is a well-known attorney with 40 years experience. He has extensive experience in legislative drafting and has participated in the drafting of the Bill of Rights in the final constitution, various labor statutes, including the Labor Relations Act, the National Economic Development and Labor Council Act, and the Mine Health and Safety Act. Professor Cheadle has been an author and editor of various books and journal articles on labor and constitutional law. He has also been an acting judge in the High Court as well as the Labor Court. He sits on the International Labour Organization's Committee on Experts on the Application of Conventions and Recommendations. And lastly, he's a professor emeritus of public law at the University of Cape Town. So this is our amazing panel. Thank you all for joining us. I'll just kick off with some thoughts, and then I'll start by inviting Tessa to give her input. I think it's important to start with the context of where we are in COVID. Right now, we are currently out of the third wave, but hotly anticipating a fourth wave. And I see that Business for South Africa has actually called for more vaccination and a mandatory approach in order to be able to manage the fourth wave. We currently are sitting at 88,466 deaths in South Africa from COVID. And the epidemiologists are expecting that that number will significantly increase because of the high number of excess deaths. Our vaccination rates are at about 10 million people who are fully vaccinated. It's mostly the Pfizer vaccine, which is the 2-dose, as well as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which we have an arrangement, we have an agreement to get some more doses coming up. I think also the global context is quite important. We are in a position where we can talk about vaccine mandates in South Africa because we have a vaccine rollout, a mass vaccination rollout. There are many countries in Africa that don't have vaccines, that don't have sufficient vaccines. And globally, the availability of vaccines is very low in the developing world. Now, the pharmaceutical companies who have developed these vaccines will say that the low vaccination rates are due to hesitancy rather than availability of vaccines. And the CEOs of these companies like Moderna have suggested that they don't have a choice in this. But we also know that our government, as well as 100 other governments around the world, are trying to get intellectual property waived in order to increase access to vaccines so that people around the world globally can have access to those vaccines. We know that vaccines are the way to get out of this pandemic, but we also know that hesitancy is a real thing. So we're going to talk about that. And I would like to invite Tessa Dooms first to make an input. Thanks, Tessa. Tessa, do you want to unmute yourself?
Can you see me and hear me now?
Yep, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Tessa Dooms. And today I'm going to be speaking mostly from experience that I've had in the last year. I'm working with an organization called COVID Comms. And from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, we realized the importance of communication and ensuring that people get information about COVID-19 in ways that are not only accessible in terms of demystifying the science, but in ways that are also accessible in terms of people hearing about COVID and COVID-19 and now vaccinations from communities of trust. And that's probably going to be the biggest part of what I want to talk about today in terms of vaccination, is this question of trust and how important trust is going to be and building trust is in getting as many people vaccinated in the country as possible. So when we think about what is necessary for us to get some kind of grip on COVID-19, and it's a mistake for us to at any point communicate to anyone that what we're trying to get to is a post-COVID society. I think that's one of the things we need to bear in mind as we have this conversation, is that we don't want to say anything to anybody that is untrue. And one of the things that's untrue is that we're going to have a post-COVID society. All of the measures that we are putting in place, including vaccination, are about getting us to a point where we can control COVID-19 and normalize COVID-19 as every other illness that we have in society, that doesn't overwhelm the public healthcare system, that doesn't have consequences for people with comorbidities in ways that cause hospitalization and death almost as a matter of course, and ways to control things like long COVID, which is the experience of having side effects and complications from COVID-19 long into the future. And we need to get to the point where we can do that. And vaccines are one of the big first steps towards a normal society where COVID-19 is a disease like any other. And the reason why I think that's important messaging for us to get out into society is that people are questioning, especially people who are hesitant rather than who are anti-vax. They're questioning why vaccines are important if COVID's not going to go away. And that's the first question to answer if we want people to get vaccines. And the real answer is that if we're going to have COVID with us for the rest of the time that we know ourselves in the society, we need a manageable COVID-19. But getting to manageable COVID-19 should not have to go through what we've gone through in the last 18 months, where people are going through a process of getting infected by COVID-19 and then having to get natural immunity, because that is a flip of a coin and a risk that we don't want people to have to take in order to build up immunity. So why is the mandate conversation so important in the context of the fact that we know we need vaccination? We need up to 70% of our society vaccinated, particularly the adult population at this point, vaccinated for us to have some sense of generalized immunity and enough people who are building resistance so that we decrease the amount of spread and then decrease the kind of harmful effects around death and hospitalization. What we need to start saying to people is that we all need to be a part of this. That's why we are having conversations about mandates in the first place, is that we can't do this alone. When you're dealing with a communicable disease and you're dealing with something that some people will have worse effects than others, even though they're spreading it to other people, we have to be able to communicate that this is not about your individual health alone. This is about public health. And vaccines and vaccine mandates become important conversations when it's not about your health alone, it's about the health of the public. And I'm pretty concerned about where we are as South Africa when it comes to vaccine uptake. Because initially we were having problems with access, and there's still access conversations to be had. But now that we do have access to all adults in South Africa, and we're still seeing the slow uptake, there are questions about trust in the safety of the vaccine, trust in the motives behind big pharmaceutical companies, industry players, governments in giving out the vaccines, which have valid history behind it. There are valid histories behind the ideas that particularly people in Africa feel that big pharma, Western companies and corporations, governments have not always been ethical in the way that we've dealt with medicines and pharmaceutical products in African markets, and we have to address those things. There's trust in terms of the question about how the vaccines were made and about side effects, and we're not being as open and honest perhaps about having difficult conversations about the fact that side effects is part of vaccination journeys and stories, and we need to be able to do that. So there's many layers of trust that need to be built. And the question about vaccine mandates for me is, do vaccine mandates build trust or diminish trust? Now, in a context where you already have these layers of trust that's questionable, you have vaccines that are coming from other countries that and companies that are not willing to disclose everything there is to know about the vaccine. You're doing it in a context of science that is new and technology that is new that people are still grappling with. You're doing it in the context of things that are not indigenous and to our context and local context, where we're not always talking about in the same ways that Western countries might be about flu shots. Even though we have flu shots available every year in the country, we don't have the kind of communication that makes people feel like it's a part of their everyday life. And to be fair, we don't even do that with vaccines in general, even though we know all children are vaccinated. We haven't had good public health communication about vaccines in general. So there's a lot of things that are unknowns to people. And now we're saying to them, even though there are many unknowns that nobody's having full conversations with, you have to participate in this public health initiative. And that's where we're losing people. People are saying, until I understand what it is I'm doing, why am I being told that I must do it? We cannot start, and we've done this time and time again in this pandemic, we cannot start with what people must do before we're willing to tell them why they should do it. And before we're willing to have what I call vaccination conversations in this country, where we're willing to confront the very real issues people have, the very real points of mistrust that they have, the very real questions that they have. And then when we segue straight from, we recognize that there are these unanswered questions for many South Africans. But because we have this public health imperative, we're going to go straight past answering those questions, doing the work of communicating the answers, doing the work of telling people what we do or we don't know, and we rush straight towards mandating things. People get suspicious. They feel like it's not that you don't have the answer, it's that you don't want to give them the answer. Or they feel like you don't want to do the work of answering the question because you know the answer is going to be bad, and it's easier just to coerce them. Because that's what a vaccine mandate feels like. It feels like coercion. And coercion in a context where the people who are manufacturing the vaccine are far away, and the people who are administering the vaccine are governments that people don't trust. Again, trust. And so when I think about the vaccine mandate, from a public health communications perspective, I don't want us to push mandates before we push trust. I want us to start at the point where we say, we don't want to have to mandate people to do something before we're able to answer sufficiently the questions that they have. I'd like us to move in the direction of persuasion rather than mandating people. And in our context is are there contexts in South Africa and around the world where mandates are going to become increasingly necessary? Yes, there are, unfortunately. When we think about workplace contexts, we know what COVID-19 has done to the economy, what it's done to workplaces. And so it's not beyond reason for workplaces to think about vaccinations as a safety measure that is consistent with the idea of creating a safe workplace and a work environment. So as we're hearing about employers, universities creating localized vaccine mandates, they are good rationales for those in terms of the responsibility that those spaces have to create healthy environments. But I must urge us to think about the ways in which we're communicating what needs to happen here. The mandate is we must all participate in public health if we are going to control this COVID-19 pandemic. But what we must not do is make people feel like their concerns are not legitimate. Make people feel like the work that it takes to allay their fears, convince them, provide them with the facts and the information that they need is not worth it, because we can either bribe them, and I call incentives bribes, and we can have a different conversation about that, but particularly force them. Because at the end of the day, and this will be my parting shot, at the end of the day, one of the things that we learned during the HIV pandemic, and I want us to think about the vaccine and the condom as in the same category of things for the purposes of this argument, is that if we were able to mandate condoms, would people have used them? Because, of course, sex and condom usage is a much more private thing. And so we were never going to be able to mandate condoms. And so what we did was we invested in the kind of public health messaging that went to ground, that went to people's communities, that went to individuals, that was innovative, that thought about these things in lots of different complex ways. But because we have a vaccine and it's something that is less private and more public, we are not doing the work I think that we should be doing to bring people on board. And so if we learned anything from HIV, is that to change behavior is not about fear. It's not about exclusion. It's not about telling people, if you don't do this, you won't be able to access that. It's actually about engaging people as reasonable and rational people who have valid concerns and fears that we need to be able to respond to, fears that we need to be able to allay. We need to make vaccination as easy as possible, not just accessible in terms of how many vaccines are out there. And we need to make sure that every question that South Africans have are answered and answerable. Until we do that, we are willing to invest in the hard work. Vaccine mandates are going to cause more hesitancy rather than less hesitancy.
Thank you, Tessa, for that input. I think the point that you make about trust is such a critical one. And I think it goes across government, right? It's not just vaccines, but there's a general sense of mistrust. And I wonder what you think the impact of the corruption that we've seen around PPE, around the Digital Vibes contract, which was actually intended to do the very thing you're talking about, which is to lay out a communications plan that reaches people in the ways that they understand and is engaging enough to answer their questions and allay their fears. So what is the impact of seeing the Minister of Health having to step down, the Director General having to step down, the Deputy Director General to have to step down? What impact is this having on this question of trust?
So there are two layers of impact. The one is a very practical one, where we've missed out an opportunity to harness trust that South African population put in government right at the beginning of this pandemic. If you asked me 2 years ago that if a president in this country stood at a podium and told everybody to stay home for 5 weeks, that we would not have this country erupting into pandemonium and people just resisting at all costs, I would have said absolutely not. People are just going to take to the streets and say no. So when government showed that they had that level of trust from society at that moment, they needed to leverage that as much as possible. If you could get people to stay home, surely you could get information to them. Surely you could manage communities in a way that there was access to information, access to health services, and things just in people's local languages that they could relate to. I think government missed out that opportunity. And then when people hear that, oh, what happened with the money that could have been messaging to us and answering the questions that we have was corruption, that opens itself up to the second layer of things where people feel like, and again, there's a legitimate concern that COVID-19 is a money-making scam for big corporates and government. And so when people see that level of corruption, and not only in the comm space, in the PPE space and otherwise, these ideas of this is about economic sabotage, it's about a way to use fear and all of that for government to milk more money from the system. All of those things become legitimized when we see government misusing the trust that they had and misusing the money that has come through the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it definitely didn't help us at all that the scandals that have happened in this space have been so close to the COVID pandemic itself.
Thank you, Tessa. And before I move to Safura, just one last question. Do you think that it's relevant to people who are hesitant or have levels of mistrust in vaccines or the government? Is it relevant to talk about the impact that COVID has had on the economy, the fact that we're in an unemployment crisis, we have a mental health crisis? As we've seen from the NIDS CRAM survey, there's a direct correlation between the COVID pandemic and increased depression amongst people in South Africa. There's also a gender-based violence pandemic that existed but was exacerbated by the pandemic.
One of the questions that I've heard about people who are vaccine hesitant is, why is the vaccine free and who's benefiting from the vaccine? So a very kind of economics 101 question is, if I'm, they say in the tech industry, if something is free, that means you're the product. And people are applying that logic to free vaccines. And I think we do need to then explain the economics behind vaccination in that sense. We need to say that part of us getting to higher levels of vaccination is about saving money in our healthcare system, because right now we are stretched in terms of our capacity in the healthcare system. We need to get more people employed to meet the kind of demand that COVID-19 is causing, but we don't have the ability to do that. We also need to get people back to work. We need safe working environments. We need big events to come back. We need sports, and we need recreation and entertainment to create jobs in the economy. And so people need to see that this is not also just about public health. It is also about the economy. It is also about their communities and their lives. And that's who benefits. And so the question then becomes, yeah, but then why are the pharmaceuticals giving us for free if it benefits us? Because in honesty, it also benefits them. It benefits everybody to have more active participants in the economy. And we need to remember that part of what's actually fueling misinformation around vaccines is there are these economic wars that happen between big pharma companies. And there are pharmaceutical companies that would prefer that the vaccines available right now are rejected so that there could be. Those are conversations that are difficult to have, but they're important to have, because at the end of the day, that's what people are trying to find out. They're trying to find out, is it in my best interest to take this vaccine? And the answer is, it is in our best interest to take this vaccine, because there are economic and social imperatives and benefits for us all, and we need to spell those out and weigh them up against the benefit to the big pharma company.
Great, thank you so much, Tessa, for those inputs. So from economic and social issues, I'm going to move to Safura to talk about the public health side of things. And I would just like you to make your input, and then we'll have some questions. I see there are questions coming in the chat. Keep them coming.
Great. So I made some slides because I think I would be kicked out of the public health community if I didn't. So I'm sharing them. I hope everybody can see them clearly, but please let me know if you can't. My name is Safara Abdul Karim, and I am a researcher and public health lawyer. I'm going to speak today about some of the legal issues that arise when considering whether or not to introduce mandatory vaccination. I don't have a particularly strong standpoint on whether or not we should have mandatory vaccines, so I'm just trying to lay out the landscape as it currently stands. So we know that there's a lot of controversy around these vaccine mandates. Some of these are the pictures that have happened around the protests in Cape Town against making vaccines mandatory. But we also have a very legitimate reason why we want people to take vaccines. We've also seen very different approaches adopted around vaccine mandates. We've seen the government say that they're encouraging vaccinations, but not going to force anybody to take them. We've seen a whole slew of big businesses begin to introduce mandatory vaccine policies. And so it's worthwhile to just rewind and think about, what does it mean when we talk about a vaccine mandate? And essentially, vaccine mandates are policies, laws, or regulations that aim to incentivize vaccine-hesitant individuals to get vaccinated or disincentivize them from avoiding getting vaccinated by restricting or limiting their access to certain amenities or certain services unless they are vaccinated. And that's like quite a broad definition. It doesn't just mean that the government is going to pass a law that says that vaccines are compulsory. It can look like a multiplicity of activities, actions, and decisions. So in that context, what have vaccine mandates looked like globally? And we've seen that a number of, in particularly high-income countries, a number of places have introduced different types of vaccine mandates. For example, New York was one of the first cities to introduce a type of mandate through the introduction of the Key to NYC pass. And basically what that is that you cannot access certain restaurants, certain public spaces, and even private spaces unless you have this pass, which is basically a vaccine certificate. We've also seen that at a federal level, the US government has mandated vaccination. And for those who don't want to take a vaccine, they are required to get tested bi-weekly. We've also seen vaccine mandates introduced in a more traditional sense in countries like Italy, France, and Greece for healthcare workers specifically. And the last thing that I think we're beginning to see is vaccine passports. So can South Africa make a COVID-19 vaccine mandatory? At the moment, there are two laws that could be used to make a vaccine mandatory, but both of these apply to mandating or compelling an individual on a case-by-case basis. So in other words, somebody needs to be identified as needing a vaccine, and there needs to be a court process that is followed in order for the state to vaccinate that person without their consent. So it's quite difficult to apply these to a population level mandate or a blanket mandate. And I'll just speak briefly about both. They follow more or less the same procedure. The notifiable conditions regulations are under the auspices of the National Health Act and have previously been used to compel individuals to isolate when they had XDR-TB against their consent. The state of disaster regulations, which I think we're all extremely familiar with, contemplate certain types of government officials being able to approach a magistrate's court to compel somebody to be treated or take some type of prophylactic biomedical intervention to prevent COVID-19. We have had other examples of vaccine mandates in South Africa that apply at a broader population level. The first, and I think probably the one that a lot of people were not aware of until very recently, is the yellow fever vaccine passport, which was introduced in South Africa after the World Health Organization amended its international health regulations to suggest that a yellow fever vaccine passport be required when somebody is traveling to or from a high-risk country. So if you want to travel to places in East Africa, for example, you are required as a South African to have a yellow fever vaccine passport to both enter that country and to return to South Africa. And that has never been challenged. The other thing that we've seen recently is the government's decision to require proof of immunization when people are applying to send their kids to public schools. And there's sort of a bit of variance about the role of that immunization certificate. Is it that you need to be immunized before your child can attend the school, or is it just that you need to provide it? That is still sort of being worked out. And then, of course, we've seen the workplace vaccine mandates introduced by places like Discovery, Momentum, NASPERS, and many of the South African universities. So what about rights? Because I think this is the first thing that a lot of people think about when they think about vaccine mandates. Well, what about my rights? Don't I get a say? And often it's positioned as we're weighing public health against individual rights, against individual autonomy, and most importantly, choice. But what we've seen in the South African context is that rights are not absolute. And I could take you through in some detail about all the different cases that have applied to COVID-19, but I wanted to just highlight two that I think are particularly relevant to this question. The first is the decision in Mohammed versus President last year, which was about the closure of the mosques. And in that judgment, the court said that every citizen was required to make sacrifices to their fundamental rights and to play his or her part in stemming the tide of this pandemic. So this idea that people's rights can be limited for public health objectives is not new, but also it has been very strongly emphasized in the COVID-19 pandemic. In Isawa versus Minister, and this is the Supreme Court of Appeal decision that was handed down earlier this year, the court highlighted this need to make a kind of trade-off, to say that some rights are being limited for this benefit of public health, and we need to sort of, and also more importantly, they highlighted that there is a trade-off between competing rights when it comes to COVID-19, because you do have these limitations on your civil and political rights, your individual liberties like the right to freedom of movement or religion, but it is to serve the goal of protecting the right to life that many other people hold. So this discussion is nuanced. I'm not saying that the reasoning in these two cases, which were about the closure of mosques and various different regulations around the various different lockdown regulations, including the challenge to the alcohol ban, are necessarily the same as a vaccine, but they give us an indication of how these two competing values might be balanced. And so in reality, when we're talking about rights and mandates, we have to understand that rights go both ways, that it's not just public health versus individual rights, but there's a series of other collective rights that are being weighed against that individual autonomy. What I also did in my research was to look at specifically how Section 36 of the Constitution has been applied to public health interventions, not just in COVID, but even preceding COVID. And when applying the Section 36 limitations analysis, there are almost 5 factors that kind of arise when you're sort of adapting the Section 36 analysis to a public health intervention. The one that I think underpins a lot of the judgments is the severity of the pandemic or the severity of the disease. And I think in many respects, people have said over and over again that COVID-19 is unprecedented, but even in cases concerning HIV and TB, it was recognized that these diseases are quite serious and these epidemics are quite serious, so they need serious action. The second issue that comes out is the effectiveness of the intervention, because sometimes the degree to which a right is limited by the intervention is heavily influenced by how effective that intervention is at realizing or protecting those rights. And it becomes a particular question in the context of COVID-19 vaccines because of the different and changing evidence base. Do they prevent transmission? Do they reduce severe COVID? And obviously, as the evidence base grows, there's a stronger and stronger basis upon which one can allow incursions on individual rights for the protection of public health. The third factor is the impact that the intervention has on other rights. And this is twofold, and it's sort of the discussion I alluded to just now, which is in certain regards, public health interventions limit individual rights. But in other regards, they promote and protect things like the right to health, the right to bodily integrity, and the right to life. And so there is a need to balance those competing rights. And where an intervention like vaccines is serving to protect and promote the right to life, the right to health, and the right to bodily integrity, then limitations on individual rights could be justified. The necessity of the intervention is also very important, and it speaks to this issue of, is it the least restrictive means available? And that question is not in isolation. It's, is it the least restrictive means to achieve a similar purpose? And so I think when we talk about how necessary it is to see a high vaccine uptake in the context of, quote unquote, going back to normal, reopening the economy, that has a significant bearing on how much public health considerations weigh against individual rights. And the last thing, which I think is particularly important in the context of vaccines, is the negative externalities of individual behavior that the intervention, in other words, the vaccine mandate, is trying to limit. So in other words, if your choice not to be vaccinated has negative effects on society, whether that is in reducing our ability to control the spread of the pandemic, or whether it is in overburdening the healthcare system, that can also provide a basis to justify the limitation of individual rights. So there are a number of different factors that one could consider when determining whether or not there should be a mandate for vaccines in a particular environment. This is just a breakdown of how one might consider whether or not to mandate someone who's an employee to take a vaccine in a workplace. And I sort of look at it as 4 prongs that you sort of weigh up. So it's not a blanket, yes, everybody should be vaccinated and subject to a mandate, or no. There's kind of a couple different factors that I think need to be considered when a company is deciding, or an organization is deciding, to introduce a vaccine mandate. The first is to consider the risk that the individual poses to others by not being vaccinated. And a really easy example of this is a healthcare worker who, if not vaccinated, puts a lot of very vulnerable people at risk for contracting COVID. Whereas somebody who maybe is in an office job and sits in their own office maybe poses less of a risk to others. The basis for refusing the vaccine is obviously very, very important. Somebody who's objecting on the basis that they cannot take it for health reasons, it's very hard to justify a mandate against that type of individual. Whereas somebody who's objecting for maybe political reasons that are not based in fact or unreasonable, that could be easier to override. And then in the workplace specifically, the issue of the ability of the workplace to reasonably accommodate the person who chooses not to be vaccinated is also quite important. We know that from Hoffman versus SAA. And then the last arrow is sort of whether or not the employer has taken any steps to ease the employee's process of being vaccinated. So if you think about Discovery, they are part of the vaccine rollout. And so it makes it possible for their employees to have easy access to vaccines. Whereas the truth is that there is a huge inequality in how the vaccine rollout has occurred. And so if an employer is taking steps to make it easier for their employees to get vaccinated, so for example, giving them time off to get vaccinated, perhaps giving them leave if they're experiencing severe side effects, and also creating measures like WITS, for example, which has made buses available to allow students to go and get vaccinated en masse and have access to those kinds of sites. That can also play a role in whether or not a vaccine mandate is found to be constitutional. So is there a need for a vaccine mandate in South Africa? And I think this is a very important question, because recently there's been a lot of debate about whether the low vaccine uptake is due to vaccine hesitancy or whether it's due to lack of access to vaccines. The CEO of Pfizer, for example, blamed vaccine hesitancy as the reason why countries in Africa are not having a high vaccination rate, whereas the reality is there's a low availability of vaccines in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Within South Africa, there's also inequality. So we do know that to some extent, there is vaccine hesitancy in South Africa. Not all of the low uptake of vaccines is attributable purely to access. And there was a survey from the Human Sciences Research Council that showed that about 28% of South Africans are vaccine hesitant. Different surveys show lots of different numbers, but we know that there is a degree of vaccine hesitancy. And that vaccine hesitancy is emanating from concerns about the safety and the efficacy, which I think Tessa discussed in quite a lot of detail. But what has also emerged from research that I saw from WITS last week is that there is other factors that is influencing whether or not people are getting vaccine vaccines, and a lot of it is around socioeconomic status. So for example, people who live in informal townships, who do not have access to their own cars, and who are who are uninsured, have a much lower vaccine uptake than wealthy individuals who live in suburbs, have their own cars, and are insured. So what we're seeing is that the vaccine rollout is following broadly the same fault lines of inequality that have permeated South Africa for the last 3 decades. And so we need to be very, very careful when we're imposing a vaccine mandate, that we're not discriminating against people on the basis of their socioeconomic status, the basis of where they live, what they earn, or what they look like. So we shouldn't use vaccine mandates as a scapegoat, but rather as a tool in our armamentarium to increase vaccine uptake. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Safura, for that comprehensive overview. That's been really helpful, and we've already got a request for your slides, so we'll share them with participants afterwards. But yeah, so Safura, you talk about vaccine mandates as a tool. One of the other tools is incentives, and Tessa has made her view known on incentives/bribes. And is there a way to bridge that access gap through incentives? You know, on the one hand, you have expectations of provincial and local government to reach people where they are. And we've seen Limpopo, for example, a rural province that has vaccinated a lot more people a lot faster than some of the urban centers. So what role do you think do incentives play, and how else can we bridge that access gap?
I think it's an interesting question. You know, for example, we saw a couple of days ago that the government and the Ministry of Sport were trying to incentivize people to get vaccines to attend a soccer match. And I thought that was quite clever because it's targeting like a key population. It's not coercive, like you can still watch the match on your television if you want to. And I think that those types of measures, they're equally vaccine mandates, but they play an incentivizing, not purely coercive role. However, I have to say that I do think that a vaccine mandate can often be a bit of a blunt tool or a bit of a hammer. And I think it's only one tool in the toolbox. The reality is that if so much of the vaccine hesitancy is stemming from concerns about safety and efficacy, and we have the answers to those concerns, then, you know, the things that Tessa talked about around you know, education and messaging and community outreach are key, but I also think we cannot overlook the importance of making it easy to get a vaccine, not necessarily incentivizing people, because the vaccine is in itself an incentive, but to say to people, to make people, because sorry, let me restart my train of thought there. The research that I was mentioning, for example, spoke about the fact that it cost people in this particular area in Gauteng 44 Rand to get to the clinic that was giving vaccines away. Now that's a lot of money. That's a huge barrier. So for me, it's not really so much about necessarily creating incentives so much as it is about removing the barriers that people face at a systemic level because of their socioeconomic status, and making sure that those types of people who really want to get vaccinated, who have very high levels of vaccine acceptance, to get those people the ability to access the vaccines they want to take, as opposed to trying to, I don't know, give them a free Krispy Kreme donut or something.
Yeah. Great, thank you so much. And what else can you tell us about the research on the impact of inequality? You know, we saw studies quite early on in the pandemic from the US and Europe that showed real discrepancies in vaccination along racial lines. And I wonder if there's similar research in South Africa and what the picture looks like.
This was one of the interesting findings from CRAMS and from this research. I wish I could remember the name of the person. I'll add it to my slides and then you can disseminate it. But what we have seen is that there is there's a correlation between race and vaccine acceptability. So generally, people who are Black are much more willing to take a vaccine, and people who are white are much more hesitant. What was incredible is in Gauteng, there's an inverse relationship, or the opposite is true of a vaccine uptake. So even though white people are more vaccine hesitant, there's a much higher uptake of vaccine. And similarly with the Black population that was interviewed and surveyed, even though they had a much higher vaccine acceptance rate, there was a much lower uptake. So what that tells us is that vaccine hesitancy is not the complete story in our setting. People are willing to take vaccines, but they're having real difficulty in accessing and getting to those vaccines. So that's why there is this relationship. And of course, in South Africa, everything has multiple layers of geospatial discrimination, racial discrimination, and socioeconomic statuses. These things are all wrapped up together. So, you know, the inequality is profound, and we need to be very careful that we're not re-entrenching those things when we're having these discussions about vaccine mandates.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to invite Pierre de Vos now to make an input. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. Safura has covered some of the ground I was planning to cover. So I'm going to skip some of the things, and hopefully I have something extra to contribute. So the first thing that we have to think about, if we think about the constitutionality of any kind of vaccine mandate or passport, of course, not all of them are equal. They are very different, and we have to take that into account. But the first thing I would look at is the specific rights that might be implicated. And I want to say a little bit about the different rights and how that might play out, and how that might help us to assess whether a specific mandate or passport would be constitutionally compliant or not. So as Safura has already indicated, the one of the rights that might be implicated is the right against unfair discrimination. So if the vaccine mandate is going to disproportionately impact on people based on their race or their sex or gender or some other status, their citizenship, then a problem might arise. So it will be discrimination, and then the question is whether it's unfair discrimination. Unfair discrimination criteria are very similar, not identical, but similar to the limitation analysis that Safura has already explained. But I think in the context of discrimination, it would maybe be more difficult for courts to say that the discrimination is fair if it impacts on people based on their race, their sex, and so on. For this reason, so from this, I would say that if we consider the constitutionality, it would be important to see what specific context the vaccine mandate is being introduced in a contained situation, say like a university. It is much a university that is going to provide all the extra incentives and support so that everybody really can get vaccinated, and that the social economic status is not going to be any kind of direct or indirect hindrance. It would be much easier, I think, to justify the limitation of rights in that context than in a more broader context of society as a whole. So if you have a mandate that says you can't get on public transport if you don't have a vaccine certificate, it will be very different from saying you can't study at UCT if you don't have a vaccine certificate. So that's, for me, the first thing. The second interesting issue is the right to freedom of religion. So some people will claim that if you are going to indirectly, in this case, force or force people to get the vaccine, or punish people, in inverted commas, for not getting the vaccine, It might infringe on people's freedom of religion because religious groups, some religious groups at least, have said that they are against the vaccine. Suggestions that the vaccine might be infusing the mark of the beast on you, whatever the case might be. Yeah, it's interesting in that I'm wondering, I don't really know, but I'm wondering how the courts will come out on this, in the sense that there are some, but very limited number of religious groups who, as part of their religious practice and belief, refuse all vaccines or are hesitant to have any kind of medical intervention on their bodies and whatever. That clearly would fall under the freedom of religion, and it would infringe people's freedom of religion if that is their religion. What do we do with people who are Catholics or go to the Rema Church or whatever, and they say that it is their religious beliefs that they don't want to take a vaccine, but there's not really evidence that this kind of refusal to be vaccinated or to be or to get any medical procedure done on yourself is part of their religion. So then one could argue that they really using religious freedom really as a fig leaf for some other concerns they might have about vaccines. But we know from the case law, Prince versus Law Society of South Africa, the first Prince case about the use of cannabis by Rastafarian, Christian education, and so on, that the courts are hesitant to make findings to say that your religious beliefs that you're claiming are not actually valid, sincerely held religious beliefs. So it's going to be an interesting question that is maybe going to arise in the courts. But the most important right that is being implicated here is, of course, Section 12(2)(b) of the Constitution, that says everyone has a right to bodily integrity and psychological integrity, which include the right to security and control over your body. The courts have said this right is really about the ability to make informed choices. It's about agency, about your body and interference with your body. And so if you're going to require people to get a vaccine to access a job or to access certain services, it is going to be at least an indirect limitation of this right. Here, the question will be, when we, as Safura pointed out, when we look at the limitation, one of the most important things, apart from looking at how important the purpose of the vaccination is, how likely it is that the mandate will actually achieve the purpose, whether there are less restrictive means, but the other factor is we look at the right itself and we ask, how serious is the infringement of this right?
Oh, it's the prof.
Yes.
First Johnson's voice English.
Sorry, I'm not sure if that was for me or not. You can stop me if you want to. And here the interesting thing, I think much of the discussion about vaccines, about whether to get it, vaccine hesitancy, and the claim of infringement of rights and the perceptions about how serious this infringement is, depends on where one stands on the actual science, the medical science. So if you follow the consensus, more or less consensus, and you say that vaccines are safe, that they are effective to a large degree, if you reject if you accept that the chances of you getting seriously ill or dying if you take the vaccine is very, very, very small, then you're going to say that the limitation here on this right is actually not severe. It is taking an injection. It is probably far less severe than many other interventions that are made on our bodies, putting chlorine into the water that comes out of the tap, whatever the case might be. But is that the test for a limitation, how serious the limitation is? Or do we take into account the personal fears, feelings, anxieties of the people who are vaccine hesitant or anti-vax? I don't think one in this context, one should. I think that our courts usually, if they are presented with the science, are going to use the science and use that as a measurement of how serious the impact is and doing the whole limitation analysis. But it would be interesting to hear what others are saying. In the context of our law, Safura has already mentioned some of the cases dealing specifically with the lockdown. There are other interesting judgments not from the Constitutional Court, but from the High Court, in which the court, relying on specific pieces of legislation, has authorized or ordered quite severe infringements of Section 11.2 especially. One interesting case is a set of cases deals with the criminal law and criminal procedure law. So there was a case, S versus Ori, in which the court relied on Section 37 of the Criminal Procedure Act, which authorizes the taking of blood samples from an accused in order to determine the DNA, to get a DNA sample. And the court in that case ordered that Mr. Ari that reasonable force could be used on Mr. Ari to actually take this blood sample. He refused to do so and said that this was a justifiable limitation imposed by the Criminal Procedure Act on his rights. In the high courts, there has been conflicting judgments about whether a court can order reasonable force to be used on a suspect to remove potential evidence from their body. There was a Western Cape case in which the court said the police could use such reasonable force to remove a bullet from the leg of a suspect because it was suspected that that bullet was part of the evidence. There's another judgment in which the opposite was held. Probably the most radical infringement of the rights to bodily integrity and also the right not to be the Section 12.1 right. It was a case in the Western Cape High Court, the Minister of Health versus Goliath, the case of the XDR-TB, where some of the patients refused to take their medication, they refused to isolate themselves, and the court in that case relied on the National Health Act, and not only issued an order in which allowed people forcefully to be given medication to treat the XDR-TB, but also to actually detain them. So they were detained for as long as it was necessary for them to get this treatment. So the judgment is a little bit, there are many technical reasons for criticizing the judgment. The way in which the court read the relevant provisions of the Health Act, they read the right to incarcerate into the right to treat because of the definitions. Whether that was correct, I don't know. And also, maybe it had something to the reason why the court held that this limitation on the right, Section 12.1 and Section 12.2 rights of the patients was justified in terms of the Constitution, was obviously for public health reasons, because XDR-TB is so dangerous and so contagious. And also it's really very, it's also dangerous for the patients themselves. But if you read the judgment, you also see that one of the patients who were ordered was not a particularly, how shall we put it, not a particularly socially well-adjusted person. He abused everybody, he used tuk, and all as such matter, he swore at everyone. And so maybe because this is one or two people, because the antisocial behavior, the court easily struck the balance in favor of public health against the individual interest. Interestingly, they quoted from an Ontario court judgment, Toronto City Medical Officer versus Deakin, where the Ontario court similarly allowed for TB patient to be detained and to extend. In that case, it was the extension of the detention in order to isolate them and in order to get the necessary medical attention. So there are these radical cases. Whether this will apply in the case of vaccines, we will have to wait and see. I want to say one last thing about the idea of vaccines at higher education institutions. How this would be done currently would be in terms of the operation, the Operational Health and Safety Act, which says or mandates that in terms of Section 8, that employers must take reasonably practicable steps to create a working environment that is safe and without risk to the health and safety of employers. And there has been directives issued on the 4th of June this year in terms of Section 410 of the National Disaster Regulations, which allows employers then to have a vaccine mandate. But if you go and read those directions, and there's an Annexure C that you have to read it with, you will see that it does not allow for a blanket imposition of a vaccine mandate for a specific workplace. The employer has to identify specific individuals in the workplace who they have identified as being at risk or for operational reasons who need to get vaccinated, and only those people will form part of the mandate for that employer. So there's already a limit there. Secondly, they would obviously the normal caveats apply. So there has to be reasonable accommodation with an employee if it's possible, and so on and so on. And then it says the employer must inform the employee that they have a right to refuse to be vaccinated for either bona fide medical reasons or for the protection of their constitutional rights. So whether this means that anybody can say they refuse because Section 12.2 protects your right to bodily integrity, or whether it should be read as Section 12.2 as appropriately limited, is an interesting question which one could discuss further. Interesting for universities, it's not so clear at present that there's a legal authorization for a vaccine mandate for students. As far as I could tell, in terms of Section 9 of the Operational Health and Safety Act, it does place a duty on employers to ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, that other persons who may be directly affected by the activities of the employer are not exposed to hazards to their health and safety. But whether that captures and or authorizes the university to require a vaccine mandate for students is not so clear to me. They might have to be in this case, but also if the government is going to permit private organizations and institutions to, say, use a vaccine passport to allow for, say, a big concert, there might have to be an amendment of the disaster management regulations. In the end, in conclusion, so for me, it seems to suggest, all of these things seem to suggest that in a specific context where there's true access and real and effective access for everybody to the vaccine, where there are appropriate exceptions made, it will, I suspect, the court will find that it's the limitation is constitutional justifiable. In a more broader mandates, encompassing much larger groups of people, it is maybe less clear, and it will will depend, I think, on the actual the text of what the mandate actually requires. So I hope I didn't go on too long. Thanks.
Thank you, Pierre, for those contributions, and I'm glad that you took that time. Unfortunately, our last speaker has not been able to join, so we will have some questions now. I'll come back to Tessa and Sephora with some questions. So unfortunately, Professor Chido wasn't available to join. One question I have for you, Pierre, is this question around religion and what forms part of that religion. And you gave the example of Catholics who don't have a religious objection to medical interventions. How would they successfully use religion? You called it a fig leaf, but is there a way that one could say this is, it's a brand new issue, and this is how we interpret our religion?
Yes, the religion is a tricky one because the Constitutional Court has also really fudged it. So, I mean, if you look at all the cases, they just say the religion, we're going to allow it, we're going to the limitation analysis because that gives us a nice little box within which to try and balance things that can't really be balanced. In the US, I know that what has happened in some context is that a letter by one of the leaders of a religious group would be proof that your religious denomination or the group that you belong to really don't believe in vaccines and that it is religiously based. Of course, what happened in those contexts is that every religious leader, because for whatever reason, they would give the letter pro forma. And this is very difficult because, as I said, and I think correctly so, our courts are really very reluctant to second guess what people say. So unless it's clear that they're not making a bona fide claim about their religion, if you say, well, I'm from the file sharing religion, it might not hold sway, but yes, so I really don't know what the courts will do in this case, but it is a huge thing because if you think that the vaccine mandate is going to work, if it is effective, and if there are not that many exceptions, the religious exception will have to be narrowly carved. And so that is going to create probably a lot of conflict because people are going to believe or claim they believe that their opposition to the vaccine is religiously based. And those people, it's going to be a messy kind of arrangement, I think.
Yeah. So I want to come back to Tessa and ask what she thought of Pierre's assertion that in the balancing act of Section 36, the seriousness of the intervention would not take so seriously the fears and kind of personal fears of people about the vaccine, and that courts have been more persuaded by the medical views. Tessa, what do you think about that? And then I'd like to ask Pierre if he's persuaded. Tessa.
I don't know if Pierre's going to be able to respond to my answer because it's going to bypass the courts. I think the majority of these kinds of things are not going to be resolved in courts. If people come up, most people in the country, I think Sephora put it very well, are not in a position where they're going to be able to approach the courts if they encounter an issue where they believe they don't want to take the vaccine, but it is mandated, and their fears are not being accounted for. And that's the reason why I'm saying I hope we don't get there, because I think Pierre's right. I think that in a court of law, looking at the evidence, looking at the facts, weighing up the science, which is what the court will invariably have to do, when they look at people's fears, and many people's fears are not based on an idea of here's what I know for sure. Many people's fears are based on what they don't know. So in a court of law, me saying, I just don't know what it's going to do is not going to stack up against somebody saying, here's the scientific evidence for what it's going to do, and here's the public health benefit for doing this thing. That means that as an individual who's scared, I'm going to lose, and I should in that context. But it's the court of public opinion here that I'm concerned about. And I do think in that context, we must take people's fears seriously. We must be able to say to them that your fears matter, because whether they are based on some kind of real facts that you found or not, if we address them, that gets us a step further and closer to the idea of meeting this public health imperative. If not, you'll take the vaccine, but we don't actually know what the consequences of that's going to be in the future. Number one, because this is not going to be a one-off vaccine by all accounts at this point. We're probably going to enter the land of boosters and the land of many other, variants and all sorts of things. And so we're going to have to go through this time and time again. And you actually just want people to buy in rather than, create an antagonistic relationship between somebody and the healthcare system that they believe is going to force them time and time again to do this. So the courts might be right, but the court of public opinion, I think we should take a different tact.
So thanks, Tessa, for that. I'm interested in a way. I'm worried in the sense given the lack of trust. So it's a South African thing, but it's broader than that. There's a lack of trust in authority. There's a lack of trust in experts, often for very good reason. And so I fear that, at least in South Africa, we have jumped the shark, that it's too late. Because there's so much opportunity, at least for people with some access to social media and whatever, to misinformation, to just accidentally wrong information. And the matter has become so emotional and completely irrational, and people shout at each other, the vaxxers against the anti-vaxxers. And so so maybe I'm very pessimistic, or it's just because I had an Uber driver yesterday who said the whole thing about Bill Gates and the microchips and everything. And then I wonder, how are we going to do this in a context where it is actually objectively very difficult to trust people who are experts? So.
Thank you, Pierre. Thanks for answering that. I think it's an ongoing debate. And what you've just raised about trust is one of the questions from a participant directed to Tessa, which is, how do we then rebuild the trust that has been lost? You spoke earlier about the fact that there was a lost opportunity from government to actually just use the trust that they had very early on in order to leverage it in the rest of the pandemic response. So how do we actually go about building trust?
For me, I think what Pierre just said as his outro is where I would want to start, is that this is no longer a conversation about the experts. This is a conversation about people we know. Somebody pointed out that the way misinformation has been spreading, especially in Africa, has mostly been through platforms like WhatsApp, which are person-to-person platforms, where you're sending on a video or a link or an infographic or whatever that you don't really know what the initial source was, but it was sent to you by somebody you know. And people are more likely to trust information that comes from other people they know and trust on other issues in their lives, like their love relationships, like their jobs, like all sorts of other things they trust those people on. When they get information from those people in this very intimate setting of a WhatsApp group or WhatsApp conversation, they are more likely to trust that than when they hear an expert talking on TV who they don't know, who's from another country, speaking in another accent, talking in terms they don't understand. And so we have still a window of opportunity, I believe, in those relationships. And so it's almost indicative of the 14 or so, I think it's now 17 or so million people who have a jab in their arm, to become kind of champions for vaccines in those personal relationships and become the advocates and the experts that people are going to need, because I think trusted relationships are important. The second thing I would encourage people to do, and I know that healthcare workers are fatigued and tired, and I know this is asking a lot, but local healthcare workers are in a much better position to get people to understand the science than international experts are. And so I think that community healthcare workers, but local doctors, local nurses, I think have an opportunity and a responsibility, especially when people have questions about the science, to step in. The third thing is going to be about personal stories. So when people say, you know, I know somebody who died after they got the vaccine, they're not telling a personal story, of course, because they haven't passed away, they haven't died, right? And people are not asking the question, so what happened to the person who died? How did they die? They kind of just accept, because it's also insensitive to ask that question. So they just accept off the bat a second-hand personal story. But there are many personal stories. Again, there are 17 million personal stories of people who have the vaccine and haven't died. People who had the vaccine and had mild side effects. People who had the vaccine had side effects, but were able to overcome those through medical intervention. Or people who had COVID after they had the vaccine, who report that because of the comorbidities they had, they really expected to have a worse case than not. So personal stories, I think, are going to be absolutely important. And then the last thing I'll say there is around local sources. We need to build up a body of local sources in local languages that we can point people to, as opposed to keep going to the CDC and the FDA and the World Health Organization as our reference points for where the authority lies for the information we have.
Thanks, Tessa. There was a report this week about 1 million people in Gauteng who have not returned for their second jab. So there are people who had overcome the hesitancy, had gone for their jab, and then just never returned. And we don't know whether it's just a question of convenience or if something set in. But how do we reach those kinds of people that have overcome or were not hesitant at all, but simply haven't gone to complete the vaccination?
Yeah, I think that the point that was made earlier about ease of access is absolutely important. We must make this as easy as possible. Mobile units, everywhere you can. People still have the misperception that you need to have an appointment, and there's issues around people thinking you need to be insured to go to private sites. So all of that needs to be taken off the table, and ease of access is absolutely important to get those people to come back, or anyone who's vaccine ready, but just has an access problem. But the other thing goes back to this question about incentives and my view on incentives. Right. Really, the thing is we need to move from incentives to what I call nudges. Things that just in as many opportunities as possible, we have to nudge people towards vaccination. So whether that's a matter of ease of access, whether or not it's a matter of reminding people about the 42 days, reminding people about the imperative, reminding people about the science around how the vaccine works in your body. So we need, there are ways to kind of give people information that allows them to see the urgency in them getting their vaccination. And then of course, talking about the benefits of vaccination. And this applies to people who are vaccine hesitant and vaccine ready, instead of talking about incentives that people didn't have in mind. So I wasn't thinking about going to Game to go and buy something for 100 Rand until Game said they're going to give me a voucher to vaccinate. But there are things, so somebody asked in the chat about how different is this from other kinds of mandatory quote unquote vaccines, so like yellow fever. I never had an interest in a yellow fever vaccine, and telling me I could go to Mauritius if I got the vaccine wasn't going to get me to get the vaccine. But I did have a benefit in that when I wanted to go to Ghana, I didn't even question getting that vaccine because there was an immediate benefit that I wanted. So we need to
Right.
start from where people are. What do people want? The thing that they want is the way that you start nudging them towards the vaccine, as opposed to dangling new things that they didn't say they ever wanted.
Right. Thank you, Tessa. We have one question from Mondekazi, who says, great presentation from the panelists. I just want to ask from the panelists, what is the role of the Consumer Protection Act with regards to nutrient packaging of the vaccine and informing the public before taking the jab? I would direct that to Safura. Do you have a view?
I actually responded in the chat,
Okay.
just explaining briefly that the jurisdiction and regulation of that is not per se under the Consumer Protection Act, but rather in terms of SAPRA, the Medicines Act, and the National Department of Health ability to regulate labeling under various pieces of legislation. When it comes to being informed about the vaccine and its composition, I think that quite a lot of information has been shared, but at an individual level, of course, when you go and get the vaccine, you do receive a level of counseling, and you can ask any questions you want to ask about its composition and side effects in that process as well. So I think there's several avenues, many of which are legally mandated and regulated, that sort of govern this.
And also they're required to get consent, right? So in addition to getting counseling and information about the vaccine, the side effects, etc., a person being vaccinated actually has to consent on the basis of that information. So that's an additional protection. We have one more question. We're almost out of time. I don't know if this has been answered already, but one question to Pierre is about the authority that universities have to impose a mandate on students who are not employees.
Yes, so I think I've already answered that, and I suggested that I'm not sure at the moment that they have the authority. I looked around, and apart from the Section 9 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act that says employers must also protect their so-called customers or people that interact, but it's phrased in a way that doesn't make it clear that it would apply to students. And the directives issued in terms of the Disaster Management Act regulations for employers also do not seem to envisage students. So if this is going to happen, I think there will have to be a change to the Disaster Management Act regulations, because now everything, of course, is done by regulation in this COVID time.
Yes, lots of law and criminal penalties and all of that. We have one question from Julia. She says to everyone, so anyone can respond, what about privilege and the right to equality? Everyone has the same right to bodily integrity, but could we have more privileged people who can work from home, are given more choice over what happens to their bodies, reflecting on differentiated consequences of directions or risk factors? That's actually a question from Twitter. Anybody want to get into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sephora can also speak to this because she mentioned a lot of those kinds of dynamics. But I think that is true, and I think it's true across a number of health spaces and questions. There have been discussions about abortion and pregnancy in the last day or so in social media spaces, and we do afford people, and I say that word very intentionally, more health access and more health choice given their socioeconomic status, when we don't have health systems that are designed for equality. Too many of our health systems are designed for ease of use based on a consumer model. So if you can afford to be there, if you can get yourself here, we will create convenience that you can pay for. But that's not the way health needs to operate. Health is one of those things, and healthcare particularly is one of those things that needs to be as flat as possible so people can make as many choices as possible, because this is, as somebody put it today, I think very well on Twitter, this is about being human and about the ability to have human experiences without having to think about whether you can afford them or not. And I don't think we're doing very well when it comes to health inequality or health equality because of the kind of unequal society we've become very comfortable living in.
Right. I think I'll give the last word to Safura, if you could answer that and say anything else you would like to in conclusion, and we'll then close.
Thanks. I'll just mention a debate that's been happening around the WITS mandatory policy, where students are offered the choice between getting vaccinated or testing every week and wearing an N95 mask. And I actually thought, oh, that makes the policy more constitutionally compliant because people have a choice. And a colleague of mine was saying, no, it discriminates against people based on their socioeconomic status, because people who can afford to be tested are then able to exercise their freedom of political thought or religion or whatever. They're more easily able to exercise those rights than anything else. Her argument was, if you remove the exception, then it becomes more constitutionally compliant. So in other words, if you reduce the amount of choice, then it becomes fairer. I'm not sure about all of these things. Beyond that, all I will just say is that I have felt that these discussions about vaccine mandates, and in many regards, the implementation of vaccine mandates, are very premature. It's different for Discovery, where they are the ones actually distributing the vaccines. But I think it's quite premature where we only have, a quarter of the population vaccinated, where people are really still struggling to get access to vaccines in beyond availability of doses, to really be talking about vaccine mandates. This is something that we should really only be talking about when there is truly free and fair access to everyone to get a vaccine. That's just my personal view.
That's great, and a great way to end. Thank you, Safura. So it remains for me to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Safura, Tessa, and Pierre. We're really grateful to have had you. We're grateful to have had a PILG this year, to be able to have these discussions on this platform. Obviously, there are many open questions. There are unanswered questions about the legal framework, about the political framework, about social and economic status. What is the right thing to do and when should we do it? What is the right time to be making these decisions? Critically, we must have these open debates, because transparency is critically important for these kinds of democratic debates. So I want to thank you all for being so wonderful in sharing your insights and views. I will stop here. Thank you so much to the participants. I hope that your questions were answered and that it was an interesting time spent with us. Thank you all. We will leave this room and reconvene in the plenary, which takes place, I believe, in the next 10 minutes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone.